The Denver Broncos were once one of the most prominent franchises in NFL history. They've won 3 Super Bowls and have played in 8. Their most recent title was in 2016 when they won Super Bowl 50. But since then, the Broncos have fallen into the pit of irrelevancy. This team hasn't even made the playoffs since their last championship nearly a decade ago, and only the New York Jets have made the postseason less recently. When you're in the same conversation as the Jets, that's normally not a good thing. The Broncos have gone from being consistently at the top of the standings to a laughingstock. The Russell Wilson trade ended up being one of the worst roster moves in NFL history. This team had numerous embarrassing performances last year, including letting up 70 against the Miami Dolphins. But it's time to change the narrative. Broncos country, let's ride! Welcome to the first episode of the Denver Broncos franchise here on Madden 25. I'm excited to get this series started, and I hope you guys are as well. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more Madden 25 content. For those of you who are new to my channel, I pride myself on immersiveness. This series will be linked with my Kansas dynasty on EA College Football 25. The players who come through this dynasty, not just on our team, but every team across the nation, will be entering the NFL in the future. You at home will also be able to get involved if you would like to make a custom player for future draft classes within the series. Make sure to go join my Discord server. The link is in the description. So let's talk about why I'm ultimately choosing the Denver Broncos as my franchise team for Madden 25. As I talked about in the monologue at the beginning of the episode, it's no secret that Denver is not in particularly good shape right now. And they have one of the bleakest futures in the NFL. This is going to be a real challenge. They're only a 79 overall, one of the worst teams on paper in the game. If you look at their rankings across the board, they're all quite low. This team lacks high-end talent and they lack young talent. Only 2 hidden development players and only 1 guy on the entire roster has at least superstar development. Not to mention, this team is in total cap hell. The Russell Wilson trade has crippled this team financially, and we are going to be seeing the consequences for years to come. There's not a lot of optimism with this team right now, and I'm excited to hopefully change that over the coming seasons. But first, it's time to meet the newest head coach at the Denver Broncos, Simeon Bonnet. For those of you who have been around the channel, you likely know Simeon Bonnet. He was a pass rusher in our expansion franchise last year with the St. Louis Dragons. He ended up becoming the best defensive player on our team. He won multiple Defensive Players of the Year, and the former team captain is ready to lead this Denver Broncos team into the future. He has trimmed down from his playing days, only weighing in at 260 pounds and standing at 6'5". With Coach Bonnet, obviously we want to set a culture and a foundation for this football team. How are we going to win games throughout this series, hopefully this season, and into the future? I think the number one thing I want to focus on is toughness and physicality. NFL teams win games and win championships in the trenches. The offensive and defensive linemen doing the dirty work. That's what I really want to focus on this team. Toughness and grit. So Coach Bonnet is now ready to roll, and hopefully he is prepared for the challenge that sits in front of him. You can make the argument that this might be the hardest rebuild in the NFL right now, and it's a very different rebuild to what I would normally pick. I usually choose franchise teams who do not appear to have a long-term quarterback in place. But Denver just drafted one in the first round, so it appears that we have our long-term starter at QB. Or so we think. The rest of the roster is obviously lacking. The skill position room is not particularly good. The offensive line is aging and getting older. Defensively, we only have 1 player on this side of the ball higher than an 80 overall. This team lacks young talent. They lack high-end talent with only 1 player above an 87 overall. We barely have any cap space, and we have the highest cap penalty of any team in the entire league. Thanks a lot, Russell Wilson, for doing us one more favor. So as we break down this roster, it's pretty clear that there are not that many great long-term players for this rebuild. But hopefully, we do have our long-term quarterback already on the team. That's because Denver drafted Bo Nix in the first round 12th overall out of the University of Oregon. I'm obviously very familiar with Bo, having watched a lot of Oregon football over the last 2 years and seeing his progression going from a pretty bad quarterback at Auburn to one of the best quarterbacks in the country with the Ducks. The name of Bo's game is efficiency. I mean, for Christ's sake, he broke the record for completion percentage in a season at the FBS level. He's accurate, he's smart, and he's athletic. But the question is his long-term ceiling, especially considering we're in a conference with guys like Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, etc. Bo Nix does not have elite arm talent per se, and he often looks short. His downfield rate isn't very high. He's also a first read and run quarterback in the sense that he doesn't necessarily go through his progressions, and if his first read isn't open, he looks to run. So I've been putting a table together to try to figure out the likelihood of Bo Nix succeeding here. I went through every first and second round quarterback drafted since 2005 to see how many of them have met the expectation of their draft position. We had the very best quarterbacks, the guys who have exceeded expectation relative to where they were picked, the guys who have met the expectation of their draft slot, but keep in mind this is not a ranking. Guys like Jared Goff, Kyler Murray, and Trevor Lawrence are better than a lot of the players in the tier ahead of them. It's just that they were drafted number 1 overall and had higher expectations. We've got the too early to rate tier with Bo's beautiful smile, the guys who did not meet the expectation of their draft position, and then the guys who ended up being complete busts. And as you can tell, there's a lot more players on the top half of the screen than the bottom half. And Denver knows this all too well, having drafted a number of the guys on this list. None of these players worked out in Denver. Multiple other players have either made a lot of starts with this team or were just acquired in the case of Zach Wilson. I was able to do the math and figured out that pretty much 2/3 of these players ended up being bad picks, roughly 62.5%, meaning that there's only a 37% hit rate for first and second round quarterbacks. It's really hard to find a franchise QB in the NFL, but I do believe that Bo Nix can be one. With his accuracy and smarts, I'm confident that he can be the starting quarterback for our team for the duration of the rebuild. But we're not just going to hand him the job. He's still got to earn it with two decent might be generous, two backup quarterbacks fighting for the spot behind him with the veteran Jarrett Stidham and none other than the MILF Hunter himself, Mormon Mahomes, Zach Wilson. We cannot escape this man. Both of these guys have starting NFL experience and will each play throughout the preseason to try to steal the starting job from Bo Nix. It is Bo's job to lose, but again, he still has to earn it. Now, if we want Bo Nix to be successful, we need to have an elite supporting cast around him. Realistically, Bo Nix's pathway for success is becoming a player like Jared Goff, Tua Tagovailoa, or Brock Purdy. Those guys are all good quarterbacks, but they're all products of their system and the guys around them. That starts with the backfield and running back Javonte Williams in his 4th season out of North Carolina. Williams was a highly drafted back who showed a lot of flashes early in his career, but he hasn't been able to take the next step largely because of injuries. He missed most of his 2nd season, and his play took a step back last year after he returned. With Williams on the final year of his contract, I feel like he has a lot to prove. He's the most talented running back on the roster, but with it being a deep room, he's got to play well in order to keep his touches. I think Williams is a really good player, and I'm not opposed to keeping him long term, but he has to prove it this year. Otherwise, he's probably going to be gone at the end of this season. Behind Williams, we have multiple other capable backs. Samaje Perine is a smart, reliable, and savvy veteran who's good as a receiver and consistent as a runner. Behind him, we have 2 young guys who I believe have potential to be long-term pieces for us. Jaleel McLaughlin was really impressive as an undrafted rookie out of Youngstown State last year. One of the most efficient backs in the league and dynamic as a pass catcher. Along with him, we've got the rookie out of Notre Dame, Audric Estime, who was drafted in the 5th round. At just 20 years old, Estime is one of the youngest players in the NFL. He's a big, bruising, powerful back who I plan on utilizing quite a bit this year, and I think there's a world where he does become our long-term running back. It's an interesting backfield with 4 guys who are good enough to get reps, but I'm not sure if we do have our long-term lead runner on the roster. That brings us to the pass catchers. It's not a great receiving corps, but there are some good players. particularly Courtland Sutton, the 28-year-old veteran entering his 7th season out of SMU. Sutton's been a really good player for the Broncos despite never having good quarterback play. He's big, he's reliable, and he's coming off arguably the best season of his career where he scored 10 touchdowns a season ago and really helped me out in fantasy football. I appreciate it, Courtland. This is a guy who I want to keep on the roster because he's very clearly our best offensive skill position player, and Bo Nix is going to need a guy like Courtland Sutton for his development. His big size and large catch radius will do wonders for a young quarterback like Bo Nix. He's got 2 years left on his deal and will be a free agent by the time he's 30. He's been floated in trade rumors in the past, and I think given the right opportunity, it doesn't hurt to explore those, but for right now, I think we need Sutton on the roster to help with Bo Nix's development. Behind Sutton, we have a lot of question marks with this group. There are some good players, but a lot of overlapping skill sets and some intriguing young players with upside. That starts with Josh Reynolds, who was signed from the Lions this offseason, and Tim Patrick. Both of these guys are really similar players. They're big, they've got long arms, big catch radiuses, and again, I think will be beneficial for Bo Nix. But why do we have two of this type of player when we only need one? Of the two, I think Josh Reynolds is a little bit better. Having watched him closely with Detroit over the last few years, I think the Lions made a big mistake letting him go. He was a super important part of that offense and should have been a priority to bring back given how cheap he was. Tim Patrick, meanwhile, is a very similar player, but a very different story. Patrick was a feel-good guy, an undrafted free agent to a quality starter for this Broncos team, but he hasn't played a snap of football in 2 years. He's gotten hurt in camp in back-to-back seasons, but he's healthy now and he's ready to roll on the last year of his contract. Patrick is now 30 years old, and after 2 season-ending injuries, he has a lot to prove, especially with the signing of Josh Reynolds, who's probably going to take some snaps away from him. With these guys all being at least 28 years old, I'm not so sure they're going to be long-term pieces for us, but there are a couple guys in the receiving room who I do hope will be here for the long haul, and that starts with Marvin Mims, a second-rounder last year out of Oklahoma, 5'11", 180 pounds. Mims is dynamic with the ball in his hands and was one of my favorite players in last year's class. This is a guy I was super high on, and I think once he gets a bigger role, he's got a chance to be a really good player for this team, and we're going to utilize him a lot this year. He made the Pro Bowl as a kick returner last year, showcasing his ability with the ball in his hands. I think whether we play him in the slot or on the outside, we're going to look to get him opportunities after the catch. And the same goes for Troy Franklin, who was drafted in the 4th round this year out of Oregon, coming in with hidden development. Obviously, he's already got chemistry with Bo Nix, which I think is a really big deal. For Bo Nix to already be comfortable with one of his receivers suggests that Franklin probably needs to find the field pretty early on. Not only do we already have chemistry between the two players, but I think Franklin's one of the most talented receivers on the roster and really should not have slipped in the draft as far as he did. 6'2", 176. He's skinny. He doesn't have elite play strength, but he's another guy who can really stretch the field and is dynamic with the ball in his hands. I'm excited about Marvin Mims and Troy Franklin, and we are certainly going to work the two of them within the offense. Outside of those 5, we've got some other guys vying to make the roster, including Philip Dorsett, who's been a solid veteran. Brandon Johnson played here quite a bit last year. Little Jordan Humphrey, pretty solid special teamer. Davon Vele, an undrafted rookie with big size and speed. Let's move over to the tight end position, where obviously the headline name here is Greg Dulcich, who was drafted in the 2nd round a couple years ago out of UCLA. So far, it hasn't really worked out for Dulcich, who was one of the best prospects at his position in the 2022 draft class, but he has not been able to stay on the field. Dulcich has played only 12 games in his NFL career, and within those 12 games, he's shown some promise, especially as a rookie. Dulcich is not a great blocker, but he is an exceptional athlete and a dynamic playmaker. I think he still has a really high ceiling, but he has to prove it this year. He needs to show that he can stay healthy. Adam Troutman is also a capable player, former day 2 pick out of Dayton, followed Coach Sean Payton from New Orleans to Denver. Now Coach Payton's obviously gone, but Troutman is still around. Let's move over to the offensive line now, which is one of the strengths of this roster. We have a good line, but it's also an older group as well. Our 2 tackles are 32 and 29 years old respectively. It's also a very expensive offensive line with 3 guys here set to make at least $15 million next year, including offensive guard Quinn Miners, who is easily one of the best building blocks on this entire roster. Miners is one of the best run blockers in the NFL. He is nasty, he is vicious, and he will get in your face. I'd love to see him improve as a pass blocker, but nonetheless, he is a tremendous player, having been drafted in the 3rd round a few years ago out of Wisconsin Whitewater. It's pretty cool having the best D3 player in the NFL on our team. Miners just recently signed a 4-year extension for $72 million, and I will be putting that into the game once the season starts. We also have a pretty good tackle duo. That starts with Garrett Bowles, the former first-rounder out of Utah. Bowles has been a quality starter for this team over the last 7 years, but he's on the final year of his deal. He's 32 years old, and given his age, I'm not sure he's going to be a long-term piece here. He's asking for around $15-16 million for next season, which I think is fair, but keep in mind, he's going to regress a lot. On the right side, we've got Mike McGlinchey, who's been here a few years after being signed from the 49ers. McGlinchey's a solid player. He's not anything exceptional, but he's a decent starter. He'll be making a lot of money, though, over the next few years, and we're kind of going to be forced to keep him around since he'll be making a lot of money over the next 3 years, specifically $72 million between seasons 2 and 4. So I have a feeling McGlinchey's going to be our right tackle for quite a bit. McGlinchey's a fine player. Since he's 29 years old, he's not really going to get much better, but I don't think he's going to regress that much over the next few years. So he's a quality starter. I don't love giving him $24 million a year, but you can do a lot worse at right tackle. 3 of our 6 highest rated players are on the offensive line, showing how much of a strength this position group is, and even the other 2 starters are fine players as well. Ben Powers at left guard is a quality starter. Now, he as well is getting paid a little bit more than he should be. He'll be making $17.5 million over each of the final 2 years of his contract. Again, I don't love paying that to a 75 overall offensive guard, but he is an average starter at the position, and you can do a lot worse than a guy with Ben Powers. The one weak link on the offensive line is center. With Sam Mustipher likely being the starter for us this season, we've got a couple of intriguing players behind him with Luke Wattenberg and another former Oregon Duck in Alex Forsyth, but they're both only 63 overalls and likely will not be good enough to touch the field. I think we've got some okay depth on the offensive line. Nothing to really get excited over, but there are a couple names to watch out for. Nick Gargiulo at guard. He's a rookie drafted in the 7th round. I think he's got guard center flexibility. And then at right tackle, Matt Peart was a good prospect out of UConn. Never really worked with the Giants, but I think he's fine as a swing tackle. So overall, the offense certainly is not good, and we're going to need to improve this team in order to maximize what we have with Bo Nix at quarterback. Let's move over to the defensive side of the ball, which is also a weakness. Again, only one player above an 80 overall, but luckily for us, that one player is pretty damn good, and I feel like we have to start with Patrick Surtain II, the best player on this roster and one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL. 24 years old, 96 overall, superstar X Factor. He's the man. Surtain is the type of guy who you can put on an island with some of the best receivers in the NFL. He's got good ball skills, he's sticky and consistent in coverage, and given his age, he should be a premier player at the position for years to come. He's the 3rd-ranked cornerback in the game, and he's got good ratings across the board. There's no weakness in his game. The one question mark I have with Surtain regards his contract. We've got to pay him big money over the next couple of years, and given that he's already a 2-time Pro Bowler and an All-Pro, I think it will be worth it to pay him top dollar at the position. He has been floated in some trade rumors, but I don't think it's anything the Broncos have taken super seriously, and unless we get offered the house for him, I don't see a world where he gets traded. The rest of the defense, though, obviously, is not great. We'll start with the defensive line, which I think might be the strongest unit of the defense. It's not star-studded, but we've got solid starters. DJ Jones in the middle is a solid run-stuffing nose tackle. He's making a lot of money, but he is on the final year of his contract. At the defensive end spots, we've got John Franklin Myers. 76 overall feels really low for a guy like him, who's been a quality player with the Jets over the last couple of seasons. John Franklin Myers is a really good player, and I'm excited to have him on the team. I want to challenge him to become one of our leaders on the defensive side of the ball because our defense is pretty young. We don't have a lot of older players here, and obviously we don't have a lot of good players. I would make the argument that John Franklin Myers might be our best defensive player other than Patrick Surtain. So we're going to change one of his personality traits from intense to leader. On the other side of him, we've got Zach Allen, who's also 27 years old, also a 76 overall. Allen's a good player, having come over from the Arizona Cardinals a couple years ago. Really solid complementary pass rusher, and a guy who I feel good with in the starting lineup. Now, apparently, the game thinks we're having a position battle between him and Malcolm Roach. I usually like to rotate my defensive linemen in and out, so Malcolm Roach will be getting snaps, but this is not a position battle. I'm not going to say that, though, because I feel like that would be pretty stupid, considering that's what the reporters are asking us about. But Zach Allen will be getting most of the snaps here. Along with Roach, I think Angelo Blackson is the other guy who could see some playing time this year in rotation. I was hoping to get some snaps out of Ioma Uwazurike, who's coming back from a gambling suspension, but he is on IR and is out for the season. Let's now take a look at the edge rushing room, which is one of my favorite parts of this team. I don't think there's an edge room in the NFL that is more dynamic and explosive than the one here in Denver. Baron Browning in particular is a player who I'm really excited about. I think Browning has shown a ton of flashes in his NFL career, and I'm hoping this is the season that he really puts it together. He missed some time last year with injury, but when he was on the field, he showed a lot of promise, and this is a guy who I really feel like can be a long-term building block for our defense. Other than Patrick Surtain, I think Browning has the highest ceiling of any player on the defensive side of the ball. He is explosive, he is athletic, and he's an interesting player. Having been drafted as an off-ball linebacker, has transitioned over to edge, where he's really improved since making the move going into his second season. I still want him to work on being more of a consistent player, though. He's obviously got the tools to be a good pass rusher, but it's just about putting it all together, getting a full healthy season out of him. So because of that, I'm going to try to get his play recognition up, and it's going to receive a small boost of around +2. Browning has 9.5 sacks over the last 2 seasons, and again, that's with him missing time last year. Browning is on the last year of his deal, though, so if he does not take a step up, he might not be on the roster next year, especially considering the amount of players who we have in the edge rushing room. Nonetheless, Browning's development I will certainly be prioritizing, and I'm really hoping that he's going to be able to stick around because I really like him. In terms of snaps, I think Jonathan Cooper will get the second most among the edge rushers. Cooper was drafted in the same year as Browning, out of the same school, Ohio State. Another guy who wins with athleticism and explosiveness, but is also on the last year of his contract. Behind him, we've got Nick Bonito, a former second-rounder out of Oklahoma. He was drafted as a raw, toolsy player and really showed a ton of flashes last year, finishing with 9 sacks. Now, the pass rush win rate isn't as high as someone with 9 sacks would normally get, and he still has a ways to go, but he showed a lot of promise last year. Along with him, we've also got Jonah Ellis, the rookie out of Utah, drafted in the 3rd round, a guy who I feel like was underrated throughout the draft process, and I believe should have been a top 50 pick. Ellis and Bonito are 2 more guys who I'm really excited about developing, and maybe Ronnie Perkins is a name to watch, 3rd rounder a few years ago out of Oklahoma. I liked him as a prospect, but it hasn't really worked out. Inside, the guy I'm most excited about is Drew Sanders, drafted out of Arkansas last year, but unfortunately he's out for the season, having torn his Achilles back in April. Sanders is basically the inverse of Baron Browning. He was a highly regarded athlete coming out of high school and committed to Alabama as an edge rusher, but he transferred to Arkansas, moved over to becoming an off-ball linebacker where he had a good season, was drafted by Denver last year, showed a little bit of flashes last season, but was really hoping to break out with a bigger role this year. Unfortunately, that's obviously not going to happen because of the Achilles tear, but he's still a guy who I really want to build around going into next season. Sanders is an absolute freak show. 6'5", 233 pounds. He's fast. He's dynamic. He's a solid run defender who's improving in coverage. And again, he's a converted pass rusher. It's going to take some time for him to figure it out. And this season could have been huge for his development. But I'm still really hopeful for him after this season. And I think in certain sub-packages, we can use him as a pass rusher as well. As for the guys who will be starting here, we've got a couple of decent players with Cody Barton and Alex Singleton. Nothing exciting, but they're quality starters. Cody Barton is a 79 overall, is the second highest rated player on the defense, which, I mean, that's not particularly ideal. But Barton's only 27 years old. He really didn't have a very good season last year with Washington. I feel like he shouldn't be a 79, but I guess we'll take advantage of it. And then Alex Singleton has been a solid starter over the last few years. He's got nice hair as well, that's worth mentioning. Of these two guys, Singleton's probably more likely to stick around long-term than Barton because he's got 3 more years on his deal, whereas Barton was only signed to a 1-year contract. Singleton is a team captain and one of our important leaders, but being that he's 30 years old, I'm not so sure he'll be getting another contract with us after this deal is done, but he is going to be here for quite a while and should be a good mentor for Drew Sanders. Let's now look at the secondary. We already talked about how good Patrick Surtain is, and now we need to talk about the question marks with everybody else in the defensive back room, particularly corner. It's pretty unclear who's going to start here with Surtain. The favorite is presumably Levi Wallace, entering his 7th season out of Alabama. He's a decent veteran. He's 29 years old. Nothing exciting, but he's a fine player. I am intrigued by some of the young guys here. Damari Mathis showed a lot of promise early in his career. Riley Moss and Chris Abrams-Drain are 2 recently drafted players who both will see the field this year. Abrams-Drain is only 22, while Moss is 24. I hope both of those guys will get the opportunity to become long-term pieces for us. And then even Jaquan McMillan, who I thought showed some good flashes at times last year. Inconsistent player, but he has shown some high-end play. As for the safety room, again, not great, but it could be worse. Brandon Jones, having come over from the Dolphins in free agency on a 3-year deal, he'll be the starter most likely at strong safety. Solid run defender, good tackler, not some elite center field coverage player. We don't really have that on our roster, though, considering the other starter is likely to be P.J. Locke, who kind of came onto the scene last year, had some good games. But again, I view him more as a versatile chess piece rather than somebody who I trust in a single high defensive formation. We've got some decent young players here with Delaware Turner-Yell and then J.L. Skinner. Skinner in particular is a name to watch. Was injured last year, but could get some time this year. And then Will Lutz and Riley Dixon is a solid special teams room. And I like the guys we have at kick returner. So that's the roster here for this Denver Broncos team. Obviously, it's pretty clear that this is not a great team, but hopefully we'll be able to put the pieces around Bo Nix and build this defense around Patrick Surtain. In terms of our draft picks, we don't really have any extra picks, but we're not losing many selections either. We only have 5 picks total this year, not owning our 5th or 7th. We also don't own a 6th next year, but otherwise we have all of our other draft picks. And unfortunately, we don't have any extras right now, but you guys know me. I love moving up and down the draft board. So in the preseason, we ended up going 1-2. Obviously, the big story is how well Bo Nix is going to perform. Our offense finished dead last in yards and 29th in points, so not exactly a great start. Statistically, Nix was okay. He did throw 2 interceptions, but he was pretty accurate, and he pushed the ball down the field for the most part. Played really well in the game against Green Bay. He definitely wasn't great, but he wasn't horrible. The run game was pretty average. In the receiving game, Marvin Mims ended up being our best receiver, and I'm really hoping that's going to carry over to the regular season, and he'll be able to take a step in his development. The offensive line was okay. We had a few of our backups play really well, Peart and Gargiulo. And then defensively, the star of the show was Baron Browning. He finished with a sack and a half. We really didn't have many other guys stand out on defense. Only 1 turnover, only half a sack from everybody other than Browning. So we had to make some tough decisions in terms of who is going to the practice squad and who is getting cut. I'm hoping there are some intriguing young players in free agency or on other practice squads who we can look to steal. But ultimately, these guys will be making the final roster. So let's now take a look at some of these new storylines that are new to franchise mode this year, including the position battle that we talked about earlier at right end. Apparently, they're saying Zach Allen won the battle. That's good, because obviously I was going to start Zach Allen. So I'm happy that everybody here is in agreement. In terms of the draft class, normally I like using fictional classes with fake players, but obviously this year we're doing things a little bit differently. As I mentioned, with the Kansas Dynasty, we're following the entire college football landscape, and the players around the country will be put into the draft class. And for those of you who prefer the fake classes, as we get later into the series, it will be fictional players entering the league. So I looked through free agency, trying to find some young players who may have gotten cut who I'd be interested in, and the only name who stood out to me was Ronnie Hickman. Second-year safety with the Browns coming out of Ohio State, a prospect who I liked quite a bit, and I was really surprised he went undrafted. We're going to pick him up off of the Browns practice squad, and I think he's going to play quite a bit, being that our safety room is not particularly deep. Deller and Turner-Yell, meanwhile, will move to the practice squad, and with that, our roster is set for season number 1. We're going to open things up next episode in Seattle. It's fitting that the Russell Wilson era started in Seattle, and the post-Russell Wilson era also starts in Seattle. Speaking of Russ, we'll see him for Week 2, our home opener against the Steelers. We have 2 primetime games, one against New Orleans in Week 7, one against the Browns in Week 13, and a Week 14 bye. I've always preferred late byes. Week 14 does feel very late, though. I'm more of like a Week 11, Week 12 guy, but we'll have to deal with it. So that'll end the episode. I hope you guys enjoyed and are excited for the next episode of the Denver Broncos franchise, where we will reveal the depth chart, find out who the day 1 starting quarterback is, and play our Week 1 matchup against Seattle. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.